Insomniacs Anonymous presents the creepiest true stories collected from the darkest corners of the web. Listener discretion is advised. The Moonlight Motel. This encounter takes place several years ago in a remote part of the Australian outback. For a bit of background, I'm a pretty built 6'2" dude, and I was around 26 years old at the time. I was on a road trip with a mate, travelling around the central Queensland outback in my old semi-reliable Nissan X-Trail. We're both science, zoology nerds and had heard about this amazing dinosaur trail out this way, which is basically a grouping of these three areas, Winton, Richmond and Hughenden, that have had previous dino bone discoveries, still have fossils, as well as seriously awesome dinosaur tracks with preserved footprints. We were staying at a place 3 hours from Winton for a couple of days, and we were pretty keen to check out this trail, so we made the decision to do the 6-hour turnaround trip in one day. We were pretty ambitious and stupid back then. We left at 9 a.m. the next morning, car packed with lunch, several litres of water, and my trusty GPS. Off we went. It was a long drive, and halfway through my aircon decided to cark it. If any of you have lived in Australia or visited in the summer, you'd know it gets brutally hot. So I'm sure you can imagine the 3-hour trip there without aircon was hell. To make matters worse, my GPS also stopped working as the map software didn't recognize the area we were in. Luckily, I had an old map in my back seat, but it was pretty tough to revert to map reading when you're used to a computer screen telling you where to go, especially given we're talking the Australian outback here, complete with dirt tracks for roads and very limited signage. But I digress. Finally, we make it to the trail and kick around there for a couple hours. Not gonna lie, it was pretty awesome. And then we decide to make the trip back as it was starting to get later in the afternoon and we didn't want to be driving back in the dark. As we were about to leave, this gnarly looking old guy, who appeared to be an employee of the trail company, dressed all in khaki and camouflage gear, asked us about where we were from and where we were heading. He gave us a stink eye when I was vague with the details, but my mate told him the name of the town we were staying. He took a real liking to my mate, and he laughed when he told him about our lengthy journey in. Apparently we'd taken the long route, and there was a much quicker way to get back that would shave about an hour off the trip. We jumped at the directions he gave us, all verbal, which we wrote down. Off we went on our merry way, thinking how lucky we were to have met this old guy who gave us some sweet intel on a shortcut home. But I can't deny, there definitely was a creepy vibe coming off him. Based on the directions he gave us, we went winding along several roads in an area I'd never been in, and eventually settled straight on this narrow dirt road. We were supposed to reach an intersection after about half an hour, take a right and continue on that road till we got to a main highway that would take us back. After an hour and a half of driving on this dirt trail though, we still hadn't reached this intersection. I was starting to freak out a bit, thinking we'd missed the turn, but my mate was completely chill and was sure we'd get there eventually. I think he thought I was driving too slow, but there were kangaroos out there, and those things are seriously dangerous if you hit one. We had been travelling for a while now. It was getting later and later in the day, and it got to the point where the petrol in the tank was only a quarter full. There were no houses, other roads or cars in sight, and I was really not comfortable with where this was headed. In the middle of nowhere, in a remote area in the wasteland that is the Australian outback. There weren't even any trees, only this dirt road and desolate, dry bushland and shrubs as far as the eye could see. I stop the car and tell my mate to get the binoculars out of the backpack and take a look around in case he can see a landmark. Yes, I carried binoculars in my car, and still do. He obliges, and he can just make out a house-like structure not too far in the distance. So we made the decision to head for that. We figured it could be a house, and maybe the people would be nice enough to give us some petrol to top us up, and some better directions to get out of there. As we neared this structure, it became apparent that it was not a house at all. We pulled up out front and we could see that it's an old caravan that has been burned to a shell from the inside out. It's still got 3 blackened partial walls up though, so we can't see all the way in. But it looks like someone's been there recently, because there are animal bones strung up all over the place, and a cow skull at the entrance to the caravan. Some of the animal bones even have grass or horsehair woven into them, and they were arranged like decorations. Then we see a hand-painted sign that's been staked into the ground with the words, "Moonlight Motel." My alarm bells are ringing, loud and clear. I nudge my friend to say, "Let's get out of here," but he's distracted by something in the distance. It's a car, coming from the direction we'd just come from. It must have been only 10 minutes behind us the entire time we were driving, but I didn't see it once. It's kicking up a ton of dust, which indicates it's coming towards us, fast. It's at this point that we both hear this creepy scratching sound coming from the burned out caravan, like someone is scratching the wall from the inside. I move a little closer to try and see what it is, and there is a person in there peeking out at us from a hole in the damaged wall. Then, this childlike voice, that is obviously a grown man imitating a little girl, giggles and says, "Are you here to play with me?" My mate and I just look at each other and book it out of there, back to the inner sanctum of the X-Trail. Just as I am about to reverse out, the other car stops just behind my car with the high beams on. I can't see the other driver, but they're in my way, so I can't reverse out from where I'm stationed. I have no choice but to drive forward and turn around that way, narrowly missing the staked motel sign. As we're turning to leave, the driver starts blaring the horn, just hammering it for no reason at all. I speed off, back in the direction we came, and the other car doesn't follow. It's getting to twilight at this stage, and it's pretty dangerous to be out on these roads once it's dark because of the kangaroos. But we're feeling a bit better as we manage to navigate our way back from where we came, the dino trail, and even start to joke around about what happened. The person in the other car was probably just honking at us to get our attention to help with directions or something. I pull into the parking lot and go to the front desk area of the company that runs the tours. I explain that we'd gotten lost on our way back to the town we were staying at, and the lady there is kind enough to give us just enough petrol for the ride back. I couldn't help myself. I mentioned to her that her workmate is a real jerk for giving us those weird directions. We figured that there was no way we messed up, and she gives me a weird look and asks me to describe the guy. I do, and her face goes all funny, and she says, "That man does not work here. I saw him talking to the tourists today, and my boss had to ask him to leave. He kept trying to get the details of where these people were staying, and telling them that he had vacancies at his place, and they could stay there. The Moonlight Motel." Hunted on the Pacific Crest Trail. This happened in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon and was well acquainted with the outdoors at an early age. My favorite hobby came to be hiking, particularly in areas that are either very dangerous or isolated. The health benefits of hiking were secondary to the thrills of walking the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was far from help. Into the Wild was released in the fall of 2007, and I immediately fell in love. Being a high school senior, I could barely go another week living in my parents' house. The movie spoke to my sense of adventure and inspired me to hike the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail upon graduation. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I saw rattlesnakes and black bears, experienced dehydration, but nothing happened that made me fear for my life. Somewhere in the Lassen National Forest in northeastern California, I walked around a bend in the trail, only to be startled by 2 people sitting on a rock, dressed in nearly all white. Their faces were dirty, their appearance disheveled, and the man had a long, unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. They looked like the couple who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. What struck me as odd about the encounter was encountering anybody at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. Their white clothes could be explained away by the need to escape the California summer sun. Their scruffy appearance could be explained away by the fact that most thru-hikers abandoned personal hygiene on the trail. After I said hello, they said nothing and simply watched me as I passed. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign or not knowing what to say. I camped a few 100 yards off the trail that night, as I always did. Following bare precautions, I hung the leftover food I had cooked from that night from a tree approximately 5 feet off the ground. Packing up camp in the morning, I noticed the food wasn't there. I immediately assumed a bear had entered my campsite, so I began to look for paw prints. I didn't find paw prints, but I did find boot prints, 2 pairs of them. One of those prints led right up to the rope from which the food was hanging. I thought of the couple I had passed earlier, and everything clicked. I packed up and left. My mind was racing the entire day, but I figured the couple was simply hungry. If they had nefarious intentions, they would have come for me more than the food. Several days passed and my mind was at ease again. I'd begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me in the event of an intruder, animal or otherwise. I awoke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching. I grabbed my hunting knife. I tried to relax by telling myself that in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise is much likely an animal than a person. Then I heard a frantic whispering. It was impossible to tell which direction the voices were coming from. I debated yelling out, claiming to have a gun, but instead decided to be silent and retain the benefit of surprise. I heard footsteps circling my tent and was ready to slash whatever opened it. But just like that, it was over. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I lie frozen awake in my tent until sunrise, and opened my tent to find nobody there. The only evidence something had actually happened were the boot prints, the same as before. Several more days passed, and I was now in Shasta National Forest, probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered the couple. The trail became more or less a goat trail, being on the side of a mountain and above the tree line. I could see the trail winding for miles in front of me and miles behind me. I stopped for water in the rare shade and noticed 2 hikers miles behind me. All I could see were 2 white dots moving along the mountainside. I immediately shout out loud, "This trip is over." I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Castella, located off the I-5. The only problem was, it was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night, trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and decided to set up a camp, this time far off the trail and into the forest. I got into my tent and tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours in my tent, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night. The footsteps, the whispering, the sticks breaking. Sounds travel far in the absence of other sound. I knew they were close, but I couldn't be sure how close. All I could think was, this is messed up, so messed up. Damn it. Finally, a flashlight hits my tent, lights up the entire thing, then goes dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out carrying my knife, yelling nonsense into the dark. It was sort of like that cliché scene in the movies, where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking, and then the camera pans around the trees because the people have no idea which direction the sound is coming from. Then I heard footsteps running towards the tent. I could barely make out a figure moving in my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I tripped several times and ran into several trees. After running for about 5 minutes, I tripped, rolled, and came to a rest on a downed tree. I got under the trunk of the tree and lay dead still. I saw the flashlight moving around in the distance. I laid under that tree for hours. I was certain they were gone, but I didn't move. Eventually, birds started chirping, and I knew sunrise would come soon. Once it did, I made my way back out to the trail, abandoned my campsite, and walked the rest of the distance to Castella, where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses the I-5. I then hitchhiked my way to the town of Mount Shasta and spoke to the police and Forest Service. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and forest services months later, who told me there'd been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites throughout the surrounding national forests. However, there had been no other reports of the terrorizing that I had experienced. As far as I know, nothing ever came of that couple. It should have been a beautiful drive. I lived in New Mexico for several years before moving to the Midwest. My friend Amy and I, both females, would spend many days exploring the remote corners of New Mexico, discovering abandoned ghost towns and enjoying the quiet, desolate beauty of the desert. One afternoon in March 2010, we were traveling from Ruduso to Albuquerque. Always up for exploring, we took a back road rather than travel the more direct highway. One leg of our journey had us on NM 55. It's a remote, tiny, 2-lane highway. We love those types of roads, up until that day. This part of New Mexico is flat and desolate desert. You can see for miles, and there is virtually nothing except dirt and rock between towns, and towns can be miles apart. So we were traveling on NM 55, going north. After a few minutes, we saw a white pickup truck ahead of us, going the same direction. Suddenly, he stopped his truck sideways in the middle of the highway, blocking both lanes. We were about a mile away from him, and as we got closer, we began to get uneasy. We could see no reason for him to do this. We were the only other vehicle out there, and we began wondering if we should turn around rather than come up to him and have to stop. We were about half a mile away from him when he pulled over to the opposite side of the highway, but his truck was still pointed in the direction we were going. We tried to relax a little. Surely, this guy was a rancher or something. Maybe he was checking something on his land. As we pass him, we notice a few things. For one, there was only one person in the truck, a middle-aged guy who never took his eyes off us. And two, he was talking into a walkie-talkie. A few seconds after we passed him, he pulled back onto the highway and started following us. But he never got too close. He would get to within a few car lengths and then drop back a little, and then speed up again to within a few car lengths. We were getting nervous. We realized how alone we were. We had seen no other traffic on that road, and we hadn't told anyone about our great idea to take this detour. We checked our cell phones, and neither one had signal. Typical for remote New Mexico, but scary given our present situation. Amy was driving and speeding up, while I frantically checked the map, hoping to find a road that may have more traffic. There was no other road. We had to travel this one to get to the next town. Turning around to go back the other way didn't seem like a good option. After a few minutes, we saw a different pickup truck coming towards us. He was going very, very slowly, maybe 20 miles per hour if that. This pickup was old and beat up, whereas the one behind us was newer. Amy had us up to 75 miles per hour, which wasn't typical for us on these 55 mile per hour highways, and we blew by the old pickup. As we passed it, we saw it was another middle-aged guy, and he also was talking into a walkie-talkie. After the white pickup passed him, he pulled a U-turn and pulled in behind it. As we watched all this, we could see the white pickup truck guy talking into his walkie-talkie. No doubt these two knew each other. We were being deliberately followed, and for the first and only time in my life, I felt hunted. We talked about driving into the fields. We were in an SUV, but this was obviously their territory, and we were afraid of what would happen if we went off-road and got cornered or stuck. So we stay on the highway. By now, white pickup truck guy was right on top of us. We could see him on the walkie-talkie the entire time. An old beat-up pickup truck guy was right on top of him, the three of us speeding down the highway. The white pickup inches closer. His maneuvering and edging closer made it apparent he was trying to bump us. I watched helplessly as he got within inches of our bumper. Amy floored it. We were passing 80 miles an hour and edging up to 90. The road was flat and deserted, but any little thing could have gone wrong, and that would have been catastrophic. We absolutely were not going to slow down or stop if we could help it. The white pickup pulled into the opposite lane and started to gain speed. The only thing we could think of is that he wanted to pass us and get in front of us. If he got in front of us and his buddy was behind us, then we'd be boxed in and trapped. We looked frantically at the rocky desert on both sides of us. Our only option was to off-road it. Should we risk it? Could we speed through the desert and make it out safely in one piece? As we topped a small incline, we saw a sign that said, Salinas Pueblo Missions National Monument, and it pointed towards a road on the left. And right at that moment, a blue pickup truck pulled out of that road and onto the highway in front of us. As we came up on the blue pickup, we saw the plates said U.S. Park Service. We looked at each other and then looked behind us. Both pickup trucks did U-turns and went the other way. We followed the blue pickup to Mountain Air and made our way to Albuquerque. I don't know exactly what those guys' intentions were, but they weren't good. There is something seriously wrong out there. I notified the state police and they said they would keep an eye on things. This area is very near Balin, NM, which is where Tara Calico was abducted. It is also about 100 miles from where David Parker Ray had a secret torture laboratory. We didn't put all that together till much later. Even though David Parker Ray had passed on by this time, we do believe there are others out there like him. And whoever abducted Tara has never been caught. Don't follow vultures. When I was younger, about 10 years ago, I got into birdwatching. I was only about 12, so it wasn't official by any means. I was just some kid that liked to sneak up on birds, take pictures, and look them up in books. I decided to start this hobby by making a list, with the pictures I had printed from the library, of native birds in my region. Every weekend I'd wander around the neighborhood, which was suburbs smashed haltingly against large plots of land covered in brush, in search of new birds. With a few ponds and large creeks in the area, I found quite a few of them within my first few weeks. However, there was one bird that was sort of my white whale due to its rarity, the black vulture. There are tons of turkey vultures in my area. They are most common, but much fewer black vultures. It can be hard to tell the difference if they're flying too high. The best way to determine which vulture is which is to do with how much grey, white is on their wings. If they got closer, you can even eventually make out the red head of a turkey vulture, as I often did, disappointingly. I cannot remember the exact date, or even what month it was. I believe sometime in the fall. But one weekend, I decided to spend the next 2 days searching high and low for the black vulture. I went climbing over a small wire fence around a nearby brushy area. As per usual, keep out signs be damned. Usually you had the best luck finding a scavenger bird on roadkill beside the road, and there so happened to be a small 2-lane winder that mirrored the creek nearby, just through the foliage. So I cut across the sort of mini forest headed in that direction. As much as it made me sad to see a dead deer or possum, it was a common sight on this road. Some parts of the road almost become a sort of tunnel due to the trees intertwining above. It was incredibly easy for a deer or some other animal to jump out in front of a car in the dark, with neither party realizing, until it was too late. I didn't have much luck. There are a few crows on the smear of a squirrel, and I saw a few ducks swimming in the creek beside me, but nothing big. It started getting late, but the sun was still up, and despite the dangers of walking down a forest road in the dark, I was determined to stay out as long as possible. I decided to reach a small park area at the end of the road, and then I'd make my way back. I went through a small tunnel made from trees, and came out the other side, and was delighted to see the shape of a large bird in the sky, circling. It was just the right size and shape to be a vulture, but I had no hope on checking on the greyness of its feathers, as the sunlight was limited. Instead, I was stuck following it as it began to sink lower. After about 10 minutes or so, it landed, and I carefully snuck forward, cautiously avoiding anything that could alert the bird of my presence. I sunk low to the ground, realizing that the bird had landed in a small clearing at the far end of a park. It was just a small, open field, slightly tilted down a hill, with a parking lot at the top. I'd been there before, as it was a fun spot for kids to roll down the hill because of how steep it was. I approached it from the bottom, excitement brimming, when I heard several squawks and shrieks of other birds. Black vultures are more aggressive than turkeys, and I was hoping to catch a spat. I got to the edge of the clearing and pulled out my binoculars. Two things kind of hit me at once. One, I found it odd that they were in the middle of a park rather than closer to the road, where you'd assume they'd find the roadkill. Though I reasoned things could die anywhere, even in the middle of a park. However, secondly, it smelled awful, sharp, coppery. I'd smelled roadkill before, and in the heat of the day it smelled bad, but nothing like this. When I put my binoculars up to my eyes, I expected a deer corpse, and birds fighting. Never in a million years I thought I'd see a corpse of a different kind. The birds were there, and I remember the faint pang of excitement I still had, recognizing the proud head of a black vulture. But it was sitting on the chest of a woman, and that sucked the life out of me. I was frozen, but I could not look away. My throat tightened, and I thought I was going to be sick. The bird had surprisingly done little to the body. It looked like most of her was intact. However, there were over her eyes, lips, and private areas, which were red and shredded. If there was a big defining wound, I'd missed it between the gathering of birds and the fading light. But what I did see, I can never forget. I can pull up the image so clearly now, even after all this time. She was pale, almost blue in places, with blonde, crinkled hair. I sat there stupidly for who knows how long as the sun sunk behind the trees. This was a time before cell phones were a common thing, and I had quite the hike back home. I realized now I was in shock, and I could only move when the sudden fear that whoever did this could be nearby. I forced myself to slowly waddle backwards to the trees, not taking my eyes off the body. I didn't want to turn around. I was so scared someone would be right behind me. I thought if I just backed up forever, maybe nothing would happen. It was dusk, and suddenly there was light, high beams, from the top of the hill, a single pair. I heard the screech of tires as a car wheeled out, and listened to it veer off to the left and away, down the road, opposite the direction I was headed. That was the last straw. I ran the entire way back. I crashed through at least a mile of bush, and while I was smart enough to have boots and thick jeans on, my arms were bare, scratched and bleeding by the time I stopped. I paused midway through the brush by my house, realizing, embarrassingly, I'd wet myself in fear at some point. I basically crawled the rest of the way through people's yards to avoid passing cars. The horror didn't completely end there, as I was home alone until past midnight, as my mum worked late at a diner nearby. It's stupid and I regret it to this day, but I didn't call the police instantly. I was so afraid that if I did, my mum would be mad at me. I would never be allowed to go outside again, or worse, they wouldn't believe me for some reason. I locked all the doors, double-checked, took a quick shower, and locked myself in my room. Somehow I'd fallen asleep by the time my mum came home. I confronted her in the morning, but by that time when we made the call together, the body had been found. They took my statement, but we never got any calls back. I stopped birdwatching. Don't take the back roads. I lived most of my life way out in the valley countryside of Ontario, and I like to think that I know the entire area, as far and sprawling as it is, like the back of my hand. Adventures along long, crossing roads, pastures, and woods that made up the skeleton of my entire village were a common venture in my childhood. As a young kid, I had a habit of biking extremely far out in the hopes of finding new places. Sometimes my dad, or one of my friend's parents, would put our bikes in their pickup and take us way out onto a back road to let us explore for hours. This is how a lot of us first found out that on one of these crappy gravel roads, surrounded by thin woods, was a worn-down old shack sitting just 20 meters off the path. Honestly, I never thought anything of it, except for the fact that it was creepy. It had no windows to see inside, and I never went anywhere near it, but one of my friends at the time said that her older sister had tried to get in, and the door was always locked. We all had better things to be curious about at the time, so I quickly moved on, and it became nothing more than a mundane landmark on that area. I'd completely forgotten about it until last Tuesday. I was coming home from one of my very late night classes at university, and I usually take the back roads as they're more straightforward and scarcely have any sort of traffic. As I drove down the gravel path that would wind along the side of the country, I noticed a faint glinting coming from within the trees up ahead, maybe about 100 meters from my car. I thought it may have been a flashlight, until I realized what I was actually seeing. It was the shack, with inside lights on. In all of the 13 years I spent living in that area, I never saw the door open, and I've never seen a light on inside of the shack. Ever. Not even once. I must have driven past it probably 100 times in my life, but this was the first time I'd ever seen any sign of a person having been anywhere near it. That, coupled with the fact that it was 10 o'clock at night and pitch black outside, aside from my own headlights, and the faint, incandescent glow lighting up the doorframe up ahead, immediately filled me with what I can only describe as a weird sense of dread. It would be hard for most people not to be immediately unsettled by something like this. Fortunately, while my car approached the light, I was curious enough that despite the feeling inside my stomach, I slowed down as I was about to pass, hoping that I could see what was going on inside. And this is probably the only reason I managed to spot the dark shape that burst out of the foliage on the side of the road, directly into my path. I wasn't going very fast at that point, but I still pounded the brakes rather hard in alarm, so my car came to a crunching stop on the gravel. For a moment, I was really just confused and freaked out. What was that? Had I almost hit a deer? This far out in the country, a deer would have been the most likely and most reasonable assumption. But in the beams of my car, I could see what had stopped me. A very tall, very lanky old man with scraggly and balding grey hair. Right away I got the impression that this man was very poor. He looked dirty and unkempt, and his clothes hung off him. As I sat there confused, the old man came around to my window and knocked on the glass. Feeling my memories of stranger danger conversations with my parents kicking in, as old as those conversations were, I rolled down the window just a crack, only enough for someone to be able to hear me, and for me to hear them. Immediately I had to say what I was thinking. "What are you doing out here?" I asked. In my peripheral vision, I could still see the light from the shack, but in my mind's eye, I wasn't really registering it anymore. Silly, I know. I should have made the connection immediately, but I was still kind of shaken by the fact that I could have run this guy over. Being a new driver at the time, that was terrifying. After a small pause, the man started talking. He had a thick, croaky sort of voice, and he spoke very slowly. "My truck is broken," he explained. I started getting the feeling that he wasn't really all there. I didn't have to look around to notice there wasn't any sort of truck on the side of the road. Had he somehow driven it into the trees? As far as I could remember and see, there wasn't enough space anywhere for a truck to fit. What was the man talking about? And when I turned back, he was still leaning down to peer inside the window at me. "Where? I don't see it," I blurted. I was definitely distrustful of this guy already, and my nerves were only getting worse the longer we were alone out there. Then he replied, "It's just up the road," turning to point with his finger in the general direction. The lights on my car weren't exactly the greatest, but I could still see far enough up ahead that I couldn't imagine where on earth the truck was supposed to be. I couldn't spot the faintest sight of it. While I squinted up ahead, he continued, "I'll show you where if you come." At this point, I had no idea what this old man was thinking I could do to help. I was 18 years old, female, and very petite. I didn't exactly look like the type of person who knows a lot about cars or how to fix them, but I was tired from a long day at school, so I was absolutely not at my brightest, and for some reason, a part of me felt guilty about leaving him out there alone, if his truck really was broken. "Okay," I said, and I reached my gear shift to start driving slowly up the road. But as soon as he saw my hand, he shook his head. "Just walk, it's not far." How the hell was I going to see anything in the dark if I got out of my car and followed him? There was no harm in driving wherever he was trying to lead me, but the more I talked to the guy, the more unnerved I was getting, and the more red flags were starting to pop up. I couldn't see a car anywhere, and this total stranger wanted me to get out of mine and follow him into a dark and creepy road in the middle of nowhere. I will admit I'm a bit naive, but I'm definitely not that stupid. No, I'd rather drive to it, I responded, the situation still not making any sense to me. I could see his brow furrow, and he looked kind of agitated. He insisted, "Your car won't fit in the trees anyway." "Why the trees if we're going up the road?" I remembered what I'd just been thinking a minute earlier about there not being enough space and asked him, "How did yours get in the trees?" The only logical explanation would have been that his truck had swerved off the road, but even if that were the case, there was seriously nothing at all that I could have done to help him. It genuinely made no sense at all for me to come and help him, to get out of the car, and it was making me very scared. There was a lengthy enough pause between my question and him speaking up that I was beginning to think that he didn't hear me or something, so I asked again. Still no answer. When he finally did reply, he was staring directly in my eyes. I think I'm going to have nightmares about it for a long time. It was so sudden the way he said it. It was so unbelievably creepy. "You don't look old enough to drive." I got comments like this a lot, since I did look very young because of my size. Normally somebody would say this with a smile or something to signify that it's meant to be taken as a joke. But this guy's face didn't change the slightest. What I wanted to say next was, "Who are you? What do you actually want?" But instead, I anxiously fumbled for my phone in my pocket, babbling in a way that probably made it really obvious that I was completely freaked out. Okay, I can just call someone to help you out. There's nothing I can do." As I said that, it occurred to me to wonder, did this guy not have a phone of his own? I know not every old person has one, but they're pretty common. And I also remembered with a sudden streak of massive fear, the shack with the light on. I could still see the light coming from it just up ahead in the trees, and my brain finally put two and two together. The old man hadn't even mentioned it, at all. It was like it wasn't even there to him. What was he doing out here in that shack then, which had been locked for all these years by someone I never knew? There definitely was no truck here. He wanted me out of my car for another reason. I think maybe the old man must have seen my face, that I was scared out of my wits and about to book it out of there. Instead of any words, without warning, his face contorted with rage, and he swung his fist, pounding it against my window with enough strength to make it shudder. His eyes were wide, and he looked furious and completely insane. I was panicking more than I had ever in my life. I was sure he was about to smash through the window if he tried again. I screamed, threw my phone, switched gears, and slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. I hurtled down the road, and when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw his dark shape turn from standing in the road, and watched as he turned, walking off the road, directly back towards the light of the shack. I didn't slow down at all until I was nearly home, and absolutely sure there was no way he could have followed me. When I got home that night, I spent a long time crying about what had happened with my mum, and I don't think she believes all of what I told her. She called everyone she knew to ask if anyone knew about the old man, or if they knew who owned the shack. In a town like ours, just about everybody knows each other, but no one had any clue who he was. One of our family friends even swore he was sure it had been abandoned for years. No one had ever seen a light on or the door open, but me. I've been taking a different route home from school since, and I really don't think I'll ever head down that road again. Well, that's it for this episode. I look forward to your company next time.